Welcome everyone. Today we're so excited to have you for our second annual, event with Verizon and the campaign for fair sentencing of youth. So I'm thrilled today to have with me Abd'Allah Lateef, who is the Pennsylvania coordinator for ICANN, which is an affiliate of the campaign for fair sentencing of youth. And ICANN stands for Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network. And Verizon has been involved with the campaign for fair sentencing of youth for about 2.5 years. We've been working closely with the group as partners, and we've also been providing some pro bono support to the important work that the campaign does on behalf of children that are sentenced to extreme sentences. Our work has been really meaningful. We've spent, like I said, it's been about 2.5 years, and it has really added to the criminal justice portfolio of issues that Verizon has been focusing on. This is a time where a lot of us are thinking about what more we can do as individuals, what more we can do as corporations, what more we can do as law firms. I know because I've spoken to a lot of you that there's a lot of interest in also getting involved in this kind of work. And Abd'Allah Lateef and I are going to spend a lot of time talking today, both about his experience and his personal story, but also about the work that the organization does and what all of you can do to help. So let me talk a little bit about the campaign itself. Abd'Allah is going to get into that as we speak today, but I want to tell you a little bit about the organization, what it does, and why Verizon has had such a significant and successful partnership with the group. I'm going to read a little bit from its website about its mission. The campaign envisions the United States becoming a society that respects all children's human rights and nurtures their capacity to become leaders, responding to any harm they cause in ways that are rooted in their dignity and unique potential for change. Their mission is to catalyze the just and equitable treatment of children in the United States by demanding a ban on life without parole and other extreme sentences for children, and to create opportunities for formerly incarcerated youth to thrive as adults and lead in their communities. I still remember the first time I met you when we had dinner that night, and we had such a really beautiful conversation. And I was so impressed then by just your authenticity and your vulnerability and really your brilliance. And my respect for you has really only grown since then. So I'm really honored today that we can have this conversation. And I'm really looking forward to spending some time with you.
Absolutely, and the sentiment is certainly mutual. The respect, the admiration, both from a professional standpoint in terms of your accomplishments, both rising through the ranks with Verizon and the service that you provide, but also more deeply on the personal level, and how that very first time that we had an opportunity to engage in conversation, and there were no pretenses. There was a genuine conversation and a deep connection between two human beings. And coming from a perspective and a historical backdrop where my humanity was not always appreciated, when I'm ever in proximity with other fellow human beings who appreciate my humanity, it resonates with me deeply.
So Abd'Allah, as you've said many times, you really must become proximate to the experiences of those who have been incarcerated, and just how important that is for people to really understand the work and how important it is, particularly in this moment. So could you tell us a little bit about your own personal story? Maybe share a little with the folks that are watching.
Indeed. So my story, as I always like to say, isn't my story, but it's our story. My parents were both natives of Philadelphia, and after leaving the service, my father migrated to northwest of here, Montgomery County. And that's primarily where I was raised and had a unatypical childhood, quite typical with any youth that was raised in the suburbs. Certainly having access to things that weren't available in the city, and I recognized that at a very young age. But I had a very helpful or a healthy upbringing up until the point where I was maybe 13 years old, and I had a horrific bicycling incident where I flipped over the handlebars and landed on my face, and my teeth went through my lip, nearly severing it, and I had to have reconstructive surgery to reattach my upper lip, and the surgery was initially botched. And so for a very, very long time, I had huge swelling that just wouldn't subside. And as young children often do, I was often bullied and teased, called platypus, or anteater, or aardvark, bubblicious, just all types of demeaning names. And a lot of this would take place at school, and the teachers would never intervene, and certainly not in a serious way. And at some point I got tired of just crying. I was always shy, bashful, withdrawn, and that didn't help the situation. And so one day I told the individual who was teasing me that if he called me another name, that I would punch him in his mouth. And he called me another name and I punched him in his mouth. And I was taken to the principal's office, and because of my reservedness, my shyness, my bashfulness, I couldn't fully articulate why it was that I took the action that I did. And I said, ask him. And that was the extent of the conversation. And he comes back and he tells me that I am suspended from school. And this recurred several times in terms of being bullied, whether in school or on a bus, and I would resort to fighting and getting suspended from school from fighting. And while my parents was not pleased with that, my father at the time, he had his own restaurant, which he used to work 7 o'clock in the morning till 12 o'clock at night. And my mother was a nurse at Holy Redeemer Hospital. And so both of my parents were essentially out during the day. So while I was on suspension, I was supposed to be obviously on punishment, but I never stayed in the house. I would venture out and I would begin to associate with adults who had already graduated. Some were as old as 22, 23 years old, and I was still a kid. And thinking that I had access to things, they would ask for money for beer, for reefer, and I would help supply that even as a young age. I would begin smoking cigarettes and all of those pieces, and ultimately they became my friends. And in many respects, I knew that they were using me for whatever resource that they could get from me, but it didn't matter to me because they accepted me or seemed to accept me for who I was, and they didn't tease me for my deformity. And through those relationships, some of whom were with individuals who were quite nefarious. And ultimately, this one individual who was 21 years of age at the time and also homeless asked for my assistance to help get some money. And we set off for what was supposed to be a snatch and run, unarmed robbery of an individual, an elderly gentleman. And we went to the residence of this individual. I was instructed to knock on the door, wait for him to go on to the inside and hide. When the individual man came to the door, he would grab him from behind. I would rifle through his pockets, take the belongings, and we would flee. And it kind of went as planned, except that as he fled, he threw the individual to the floor and he suffered a fractured femur. He went to the hospital, was released. that night with an ice pack and Tylenol. He again went to the hospital a day later complaining of pain in the hip. More x-rays were done and it was determined that he had a borderline fracture, so a surgery was performed to repair the fracture. 18 days afterwards, he went into cardiac arrest and was unable to be resuscitated, and he passed away. The adult was charged, then I was subsequently charged as an adult for felony murder, ultimately convicted of felony murder and sentenced to a mandatory term of life without possibility of parole. Went to prison with the expectation that I would die there. And it wasn't until the United States Supreme Court decision in Miller versus Montgomery in 2016 that ultimately created the opportunity for me to be released.
And it was the work of the campaign that helped lead to that decision, that Supreme Court decision in Miller versus Alabama, right?
Indeed. So the campaign for fair sentencing of youth was established 10 years ago, actually, and was always engaged in the work of both on the advocacy side and also supporting the litigative efforts and the storytelling efforts to help in some ways humanize children who have been demonized, particularly by super predator narratives, but also to try to change laws that enable children to be tried as adults and sentenced to life without possibility of parole, and then obviously supporting the litigative efforts in the court to strike down that sentence as being unconstitutional. So I have had known about the campaign and its work while on the inside, and had some engagement with the campaign and trying to help support the narrative work, and just had a profound respect for how they approached the issue. It wasn't just about the legal parameters of whether or not a child should be subjected to life without parole or other extreme sentences. It was also the thing about how we value children and the value that should be placed on children, and trying to create accountability in age-appropriate ways that don't involve extreme sentences. Those sentiments, that belief, that philosophy resonated with me in profound ways. And so even in recognizing that and the work that the campaign did with all of the court cases, beginning with Roper versus Simmons, leading up to Graham versus Florida, and ultimately Miller versus Alabama, which was the seminal case that created parole eligibility and struck down the sentence of life without possibility of parole for children. And then, of course, Montgomery came a few years later to make it apply retroactively, which enabled my release. One of the things that I often think about, and I guess in some ways I am haunted by, is that a lot of the principles that were articulated in Miller, we knew instinctively about the characteristics of children, right? It didn't take neuroscience to validate what we already knew. The thing that I still struggle with is that once the Miller decision was decided, and it was clear that children were different and should not be subjected to mandatory life without parole sentencing, and that there were mitigating factors that should have been taken into consideration. And instead of addressing that on its face, many district attorneys across the nation began to say that that ruling shouldn't apply retroactively. And so from 2012 up until 2016, the fight was about retroactivity and whether these principles that we now discover should apply to those children who had been formerly sentenced to life without possibility of parole. And in that interim, I lost my mother to cancer. And so I often am haunted by the idea of not only my mother, but my father and both of my siblings have died during the course of my incarceration. So all of them see me go away as a child, to be disappeared from society as a child, to be labeled as a murderer. And they never see me emerge as a mature man. They never see me experience freedom. They never see the fullness of those values that they inculcated in me as a child manifest as an adult. And so while I'm certainly in many ways appreciative of the freedom that I have, it's not without a sense of, I guess, regret in many ways that my parents have never had the opportunity to see the son that they raised. That is part and parcel of the trauma that I still carry to this very day, notwithstanding all of those traumatic experiences and events that come from placing children in adult facilities, and all of the abuse that produces, all of the physical and psychological detriment that children are subjected to, that is compounded by the fact of what that meant to my family. And so it's ironic that we often talk about we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. We talk about incarceration in the same ways that we talk about post-slavery or post-Jim Crow or post-civil rights, as if those things are in the past, and as if they're not present in ongoing daily realities that we live. And so even slavery, right? It didn't end with the Emancipation Proclamation. We just celebrated Juneteenth, right? Which was supposed to be also a celebration of Texas slaves who were freed 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. But even with that, what we know to be intrinsically true is that slavery didn't end, it just evolved, right? And so in the same way that Jim Crow didn't end, segregation didn't end because of Brown versus Board of Education, right? In reality, we still are, as a society, as segregated now as we were then. And the same thing about like post-traumatic stress syndrome that comes from the trauma of dealing with racism in America, and we're going to delve into some of that. But yeah, it's also the case in terms of the trauma that prison produces. That trauma is not eviscerated because you walk out of the doors of prison, right? There's still certain traumas that are ongoing and impact our lives in many different unsuspected ways. And much of it is centered around the inability to still take agency and having a sense of self-determination, worth, and value in a society, and dealing with the traumas of all of those things, and trying to navigate that as you try to navigate putting your life back together and trying to unlive all of the lived experiences of what it means to be caged like animals and places where your humanity is anything but recognized.
Well, let's talk about the systemic racism, though, because as you know, the last month or so, at least parts of the US have been experiencing this awakening over how systemic these issues are. And to your point, the through line that goes all the way back 400 years. But talk a little bit about how systemic racism is operating in the legal system right now, particularly when it comes to this, unique practice that really only in the US, where we sentence children to basically die in prison.
It's stark in a lot of ways, right? We have the statistics in terms of like there's a 10-to-1 ratio in terms of the number of African American, Black, or Hispanic individuals who are charged as an adult and sentenced to life without possibility of parole versus their white counterpart for the same crime. And this isn't suggestive of, well, Black youth commit more homicides and therefore that's the rationale for the disproportionality in sentencing. No, it's not that. It's that white children who engage in the same activity, as unfortunate as that is, and we don't want to in any ways kind of minimize the impact of and the seriousness of those offenses. We're simply just talking about age appropriate accountability to the harm that's committed. And so with that being said, it goes back to a value proposition where white children who commit the same acts or engaged in the same activity, there's a willingness to find alternatives to extreme sentences in a way that is not applicable to Black and brown youth. That goes to the value that is given to white children that is not extended to Black and brown children. And it also speaks to the perceived notions of dangerousness, the perceived notions of a lack of moral fortitude, and the propensity to violence that certainly is mythological and it's not true of Black and brown bodies, but because of decades and indeed centuries of systemic racism coupled with interpersonal racism and white supremacy, there's a willingness to adopt that narrative, to adopt that belief, to adopt those structural inadequacies and untruths in a way that we don't dare interrogate them. We just assume them to be the case. And so when you see stark numbers like a 10-to-1 rate of disparate sentencing between Black and brown youth versus white youth, we just assume that there's a valid justification for why that's the case. The narratives that we tell each other, the narratives that are often manifest in media are anything but true. And it does have a historical context that leads us into the present moment. And it's all racially contextualized. Mm-hmm. So when I'm looking around the prison and I'm seeing the disparate number of Black folks who are imprisoned there, and I'm coming across and having relationship with white folk who have, in many cases, committed the same harm that I committed, and in some cases, actually intentionally so. But there was a willingness to plead out or create a different sentence that didn't involve life without parole. It didn't involve extreme sentence. And so what does that say to me in terms of the value that society places upon myself and people like me? What does that say about my self-esteem? What does that say about my sense of place within a society where this is my reality? Grappling with those philosophical questions, not only did it make me begin to question my own self-worth and value in this society, but it made me in some ways also question our level of humanity, right? And then when you couple this and have a deeper understanding of the historical context, have a deeper understanding of the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, mass incarceration, then you begin to understand that as a Black person, you're commodified in a way that slavery is reinvented in such a way that, as we know, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as a punishment of a crime. And then you begin to question, what are the circumstances, what are the structural circumstances that make crime seem like a way of escaping poverty and escaping hyper-marginalization, and in some cases, survival. I'm not saying that about my personal circumstance. I'm saying that if the homeless individual who I befriended didn't feel that sense of desperation, and I didn't have that false sense of loyalty and connection and wanting to help in the wrong way, albeit, would this have ever happened? So were there, or should there have been, mechanisms to stop a 21-year-old from becoming homeless, and support structures in place so that crime would not have been an option or should not have been an option? So yes, there's a part about self-responsibility and what it means to be dignified and not using poverty as an excuse, but also just looking at the structural inadequacies, particularly as it relates to people of color, and how that impacts the lack of choice that individuals feel that they have, and how that in itself is a contributing factor to crime. And those things can easily be addressed through a realignment of resources and seeing value in individuals who have historically and even to the present day reality still seem to be in many ways devalued, de-appreciated. And so, yeah, just grappling with all of those pieces is the ongoing struggle that brings us into the current moment. And as you mentioned and so many others have pointed out, that there's a clear line that connects the legacy of slavery to mass incarceration, to what manifests in the extrajudicial killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and over 1,000, I think 1,200 people who have been killed by police in the last year alone. All of those things are interconnected.
We wanted to ask the audience and the folks watching online and get some questions from them. So one question that came in was how COVID-19 is affecting the prison population, and just your thoughts and observations about the extra stress and trauma that might be causing right now.
In the prison context, obviously, there's more people of color who are incarcerated and therefore more subjected to being able to contract COVID. And part of the prison environment by its very nature doesn't enable social distancing, let alone not having access to adequate protectionary equipment. It doesn't also lend itself to social distancing because of the very foundational structure of what prisons or how prisons are designed. And even with that, and even recognizing that administrators are loath to create mechanisms that will reduce prison population in a way that will potentially save lives. There's certainly a disproportionality in terms of the number of Black folks who have contracted and also died from COVID, but it's also indicative of systemic racism, hyper-marginalization, and also what we look at as, what we deem as being systemic racism and social injustices that are informative of what the Black experience is here in America at the present.
Thank you for that, Abd'Allah. A second question we got is, what is the biggest misperception that people have about people that are returning from prison and reentering society?
The thing about once a murderer, always a murderer, or once you've done whatever that harm is, then that's who you are as a person, that you have the inability to transform, that there's always this perceived sense of danger. And that certainly isn't the case. It's the opposite. One, because of what we know in terms of the neurological findings and the transient nature of adolescent behavior and all of those pieces. But even beyond that technical aspect, the reality of the individuals who I encounter and who I am myself is a manifestation of people who are extremely contrite, people who are determined to succeed, determined to make amends, determined to have a meaningful life, a meaningful existence that isn't just about self-serving indulgence, but also about giving back to family, giving back to community, giving back to humanity. And so I think what people would learn is that by having proximity to formerly incarcerated folks, you will find that we laugh, we cry, we hurt, we bleed, but also innately, we want the same things that you want. Safety, security, the ability to meet our economic needs, and to eke out a meaningful existence that isn't, again, about self-indulgences, but also about contributing to society in a meaningful way. And so if there was an engagement, there was a willingness to create pathways to opportunity, then what you will find is people who are just like you. People who made mistakes, but their dreams, their aspirations, their purpose is no different from yours. And you'll find people who are essentially just like you are.
Yeah, I think that's why I've been so impressed by the work that you all do, because to your point, part of what the organization does is focus on your advocacy, changing the law, working through the courts, making sure that the system operates differently. And you've been so successful, like you said, 4 Supreme Court cases just since the campaign has been in existence. But then just the focus on, to your point, the environment that returning citizens come back to, and then how do you create that network of care and that network of support? And again, I mean, I'm just going to echo what you said. Just the folks that I know, including you, through the Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network, are some of the, I feel lucky now that I know them. They're some of the best people that I know, and the most compassionate and the most honest and the most just truly extraordinary people. And so one of the things I hope we can do today through this presentation to folks is to just give them a window into not just what you do, but how much opportunity there is for individuals or companies or law firms to get involved in one way or the other. So one of the one of the reasons we wanted to have this event is not only just to showcase you, I mean, the way you explain things and the way you talk, I was very struck by what you were talking about your own humanity, questioning your own humanity. And then for me, sitting where I am, questioning our humanity generally as a society. I mean, the fact that, to your point, that this is how we treat anyone in our society, let alone a child. So a lot of the people that are going to be watching may not have as much exposure to what the system is like, or they may not know, and hopefully this will spark, a desire to learn more and to get more involved. So tell us a little bit about the work I know that you've been very involved with at the campaign, and you're thinking about how you can partner with the private sector, for instance, like companies like Verizon or other companies that can really help move forward this work and bring to light a lot of the issues that you're talking about, but more importantly, make real change.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, and of course I didn't coin the phrase of proximity. It's one of the things that Brian Stevenson often posits as a challenge to all of us, and the challenge isn't just about what it means to be a change agent. I think the challenge is really, what does it mean to be a global citizen and a engaged and compassionate human being in the 21st century. And so he often talks about the need to get proximate, to change the narrative. And he also talks about the role of being hopeful and the willingness to do uncomfortable things. So those four things for him: proximity, changing the narrative about how we tell stories about undesirables, how we tell stories about Black and brown folks, how we even tell our own stories as Americans with a whitewashed history that doesn't confront the realities of who we are as a nation. Those narratives have to be shifted as well. But then he also talks about hopefulness and the quintessential ingredient, if you will, of the willingness and the ability to change is the sense of having hope that change can manifest through our agency. And so you have to be hopeful that we have the power and the ability to create the change that we want to see. And then lastly, like the willingness to do the uncomfortable things. And that's what change requires. And it's kind of reflective of what, even before him, Martin Luther King used to talk about the ultimate measure of a person is not where they stand in moments of comfort and convenience, but rather the ultimate measure of a person is where they stand in challenge and controversy. And so this is calling on us to interrogate where we stand in moments of injustice, in moments of inequity, and what are we willing to do about it, right? And so I think he also said that the life's most persistent question is, what are you doing for others? And this question to me is answered in the most salient ways in the goals, the objectives, and the strategies that are manifest in the campaign for fair sentencing of youth. When that comes to like the corporate and private engagement, some of that is about, again, professional development opportunities. Some of it is trying to advocate for apprenticeships or on-the-job training. Some of it is about trying to advocate for a livable wage. Some of it is about trying to rehumanize individuals who have historically been demonized. And so we try to engage our business partners with all of those different dynamics, and connected with that is to develop support for our community prosperity initiative. We think that individuals should be restored to wholeness, to the fullness of their humanity with all of the dignity and promise that entails, but also that they should have pathways to prosperity. And so the Community Prosperity Initiative is about raising the bar beyond reentry to what it means to be a full human being, a full citizen, and to to fully experience all the rights and privileges of your humanity, of our humanity, in ways that are meant to be dignified and supportive of our dreams, goals, and aspirations.
What are 3 things that either people or individuals or companies or organizations can do to help support the campaign's mission and work?
There's 3 things that come to mind. One is to connect. The second is to reinvest, and the third is to donate. And so when we think about connecting, then what we're talking about again is that piece about proximity. And that's to have like employee engagement programs that engages our population in a meaningful way, that's centered around relationship building and also getting to the narrative issue and debunking myths and stereotypes that we often have about this particular population, and creating proximity and connection, personal connection and relationship can help debunk that in a meaningful way. And the second thing is about the reinvestment piece, right? And so that's really about how we can begin to think about investing in human capital, but particularly for former life sentence children, in a way that wasn't factored into how we think about human capital on the norm. And so this also could be in the way of apprenticeships and on-the-job training, and even supporting the CFSY's CPI, Community Prosperity Initiative, endeavors to create livable wages, and doing the personal sponsorship as well, which you can do through the campaign. And then the third thing is really about donating, right? Donating. Money, human resources are always needed and important in this work. So those are the 3 things: connect, reinvest, and donate. And the campaign certainly is in position to help make meaningful changes and positive additions to people's lives in ways that I think reinforces the best of our humanity.
I think that is a great place to end. Thank you so much. As always, I love our conversations. I know we're going to have many more because Verizon, our partnership with the campaign is going to continue. We're looking forward to ways to expand it even more. And I'd like to just thank everyone who tuned in today and listened. I hope you learned something, but I also hope you have maybe had your own sparks, some interest in getting more involved. I know a lot of us have been thinking, especially in the last 2 months, about this is really truly an extraordinary year. 2020 is going to down in history as one of the most extraordinary years, certainly of our lifetimes. And there's opportunities to do more everywhere, but this is a great opportunity if you've been thinking about what can I do? Where can I help? Where can I put my money? Where can I put my resources? Where can I put my passion? Where can I get involved? I encourage you to think about the 3 options that Abd'Allah mentioned and just take action. Think about ways to, both individually and in the organizations that you operate, think about ways to take action and move things forward. And again, thank you for your time. We look forward to having another event, Abd'Allah, next year, but this time in person.
Indeed.
Because I'm hopeful, to your point about being hopeful, I'm hopeful that we can do more together as Verizon in the campaign, but I'm hopeful that we can get other partners to work with us more. But I'm hopeful about the issues we discussed today, and also just that we can all see each other in person again, hopefully soon.
Indeed, and I would just like to take a second to both thank you personally, but also to thank Verizon, as well as all of the listeners who have tuned in, and to be a change agent, as Brian Stevenson called on us. This is one of those examples of getting proximate. It's one of those examples of changing the narrative. It's one of those, as you mentioned, Kathy, about the hopefulness. And the last part is about the willingness to do the uncomfortable thing, right? So the easiest thing is to show up here today, right? Perhaps the uncomfortable and inconvenient thing is what we do next. And hopefully we avail ourselves of at least one, if not all three, of those suggestions that were put forth in terms of how we can engage. And hopefully that uncomfortable thing, that inconvenient thing will become comfortable and convenient as we engage on the long term to begin to eradicate systemic oppression, racism, inequity, and all of those things that are the worst of our humanity. So thank you all again for your participation and your promised engagement, and look forward to next year in person.
Thank you.
Some have called the COVID-19 pandemic the great equalizer. And while we're all experiencing anxiety and changes to our daily lives, our experiences are not the same. Individuals with limited resources and access to social networks are experiencing much worse. This includes people who are coming out of prison now and other formerly incarcerated individuals who are still in the process of recreating their lives prior to this pandemic. They need our support, compassion, and most importantly, our resources. You can help by contributing gift cards to stores for food and supplies, equipment for virtual connection, online shopping, and job searching, such as phones, laptops, and tablets, short-term loans to individuals, preferably interest-free, and subsidized or discounted phones and internet plans. If you have funds to donate, you can do that at our CFSY donate page, or you can email us about specific items you'd like to contribute. However you choose to support others during this most challenging time, we ask that you please consider the most marginalized and disproportionately impacted. Thank you and stay well.